Hello, everybody. Welcome to this SOM alumni webinar, Maintaining Your Values in Turbulent Times. My name is David Bach. I'm Deputy Dean at the school, professor in the practice of management. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this conversation. Good day, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. We're looking forward to having this conversation with two distinguished guests who I'll introduce in a moment. But just as importantly, we're looking forward to having this conversation with you. I want to encourage you to submit questions or comments on the issues we'll be talking about. You can do that through Zoom. You can do it on Facebook. You can do it on YouTube. You can do it by email. Anything you have to say, just send it our way. The origin of this webinar really is a group of alums who reached out and said, SOM ought to host a conversation about how to maintain your values in these turbulent times, in these times of change. And of course, it comes from our mission to educate leaders for business and society. It comes from the fact that SOM graduates work across all sectors. You find them in the private sector, in the public sector, the nonprofit sector, in the entrepreneurial sector, in lots of different countries. And we're all sort of coping with understanding how our politics are changing and the moral and ethical challenges that engaging with that process might entail. And so I'm thrilled to have two distinguished guests whose experience will help us, I think, tease out a couple of insights about how you do that. Sitting next to me is Cristina Rodriguez. Cristina, welcome. She's the Leighton Homer Surbeck Professor of Law at Yale Law School, where she's been since 2013. Previously, she was on the faculties at New York University Law School and had been visiting at Harvard. Cristina is an expert in constitutional law and theory, and immigration law and policy, administrative law. She works on language issues, and she's finishing up a book right now on presidential power and immigration law together with Adam Cox at NYU. So thank you so much for coming. I should have also added that Cristina is a graduate of Yale College and of Yale Law School, and in between spent some time at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. And that's a good segue also to our second guest, Michael Warren, another Yale College graduate and Rhodes Scholar. Michael is Managing Director of Albright Stonebridge Group, one of the leading global consulting firms that works on some of the most interesting, most challenging, most strategic issues at the nexus of business and society. Michael served as the firm's managing principal from 2013 to 2017, but previously had experience in government, worked in the Obama transition as a senior advisor, overseeing appointments in economic agencies for the U.S. government. He's on the board of OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, previously had time at McKinsey, and is somebody who's well-versed in questions at the nexus of business and society. I should have added that Cristina has also served in government, among other things, as a clerk to Justice Sandra Day O'Connor on the Supreme Court. So we have lots of expertise in the virtual room, so to speak, and I'm going to dive right in to ask a question that perhaps is sort of an odd starting point, because we'll talk about challenges in government. And the first question I wanted to ask, as you look at the news, everywhere you see, polarization, politicization of issues, what parts of the federal government, if any, are functioning exactly as you would think they should function, regardless of who happens to be the party in power? Cristina.
Yeah, so David, the federal government is vast, and the career civil service dramatically outnumbers the political leadership and appointees that are put in place either by the White House or cabinet secretaries. And so it's inevitable that a lot of what was happening during the Obama administration just is continuing as a matter of implementation and programmatic practice. But I think we see evidence all around us of the way in which the administration is subject to the ordinary mechanisms of political control that would arise whenever you have a shift from one party to the other. And then there's certain issue areas where I think we are seeing hyper-polarization having an impact, ones where the White House in particular has identified priorities where it wants to transform the way business was done under its predecessor. And I think that you clearly see that in the immigration arena. You see that in environmental law, in the healthcare sector. So each of the agencies that's responsible in some way for these issue areas, I think, has been dramatically shaken up and given a range of directives from rescinding as many of the past administration's policies as it can to changing the way, in the case of immigration, screening decisions are made with a philosophy that's entirely distinct from what it replaces. And in some of those areas, I think you're seeing a breakdown of ordinary government operations, primarily the process of interagency vetting and deliberation. And that characterized a lot of the early mistakes and controversies of the Trump years, where decisions seemed to be made without the lawyers in the room and without people with equities in the matter weighing in a deliberative process. And that, I think, is the most concerning development of all. I think it's probably not as extreme now as it was a year ago, but that's happening, and it's a product not just of hyperpolarization, but of the type of president we have.
So a breakdown in process that is almost more disconcerting to you than the outcomes of those processes, of these policy processes.
It would certainly depend on the outcome we're talking about, but yes, you expect differing outcomes when you have a new party come into power, but it's the breakdown of the decision-making process that over the long haul is concerning.
Interesting. Michael, you're in D.C. Of course, you travel around the world, but from where you sit, what is business as usual, and what is different, but different perhaps in a way that you would expect it to be, and what is different in ways that you didn't expect it to be different?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's always great to be with you, David, and with you, Christina, and really excited for this conversation. What's operating as usual, one way to think about this is that what's operating as usual is the further away you are from the West Wing in Washington, the more you can operate business as usual. In large part for the reason that Christine just outlined, which is that the processes in place, the interagency processes, the other processes that the White House has typically used to operate the government are not being used as fulsomely as they have in prior administrations, whether they were Democrat or Republican administrations. You can see that by the number of people who have been appointed for jobs. During the Obama administration, we were fortunate enough to be able to appoint 1,000 people to jobs in 100 days. And into the first year, the number was somewhere around 250 appointees. That means that these processes
250 in the current administration, you mean the Trump administration?
The current administration.
So a quarter.
At the end of about a quarter.
Yeah.
And that means that the processes just can't function because there aren't people there to actually run them, to be able to administer them, to be able to take the decisions, and be able to get all the stakeholders engaged to be able to get to the right answer. So places that are working are places like OPIC, which is a pseudo-independent agency. It has its own charter. It's certainly under the auspices of the White House, but it has its own operating principles. And there you're seeing in a lot with an incredible amount of bipartisanship. I'm still on the board, so I still chair the audit committee for the Overseas Private Investment Corporation in this administration. The former chair and CEO of OPIC, Elizabeth Littlefield, who works with us here at ASG, just talked with her 20 minutes ago, has just informed me that she has had 27 meetings on the Hill in support of this administration's leadership's view towards creating basically a sovereign wealth fund, $100 billion of a new development finance agency that will have much more fulsome authorities than the current OPIC does, which is already pretty potent. So you're seeing some places where business as usual is happening. Places where you would expect things to be different, as Christina mentioned, are just policy changes. The EPA and environmental policy, immigration policy, foreign policy and how we conduct it, all are being conducted very differently in this administration. They have different points of view. Places where we didn't expect is that, again, back to the apparatus. The ambassadors simply aren't used in this administration, and they are critical components for both intelligence and also for stakeholder management and for advice and counsel in countries. As an example, And you can see that in the dismantling of the State Department, which we've read a lot about in the press. And so those are places where it's just very different than any other administration.
You talked about appointments, the number of open jobs, and even when jobs are filled, people not being leveraged perhaps in the way you'd expect. For a lot of people, when President Trump won the election, surprising, people had to, so the never-Trumpers had to decide what they would do. Lots of people had to decide, what do we do? Do we get involved? Do we not get involved? And so I'd love to get your thoughts on people you speak with, in the legal community, in the policy community. Michael, in your case, also, of course, policy, but also the business community. How do people sort of figure out whether they should get involved or stay at the sidelines?
I think whether to get involved depends first on whether you share a broad ideology with not just the president, but the party.
Yeah.
And so that's obviously the first cut for people who might consider becoming political appointees. But then I think one has to decide whether he or she believes that it's possible to be in a position to restrain what might seem like, or what are excesses, either abuses of power or skirting around ordinary processes. And I know that there are people who've taken political appointments who believe that in the case of the legal community that they stand for the right interpretation of the law. And obviously a Republican political appointee will think about certain interpretive questions differently, but there can still be integrity to that. Not everyone thinks that that's possible, right? And some of it depends on how close you are to the White House, where I think maintaining business as usual is harder. And some of it depends on how strong the agency that you would be going into is. What's the institutional culture like, and does it revolve around ensuring the integrity of the department? I would say among the things that most concerns me is what's happening to the Department of Justice, where it's not just that you have a shift in criminal justice policy, it's a circumstance where the very independence of law enforcement and legal investigations are being questioned at the highest levels, and the leadership itself feels like it's under siege. But I think that the fact that the leadership is holding the line is at least a positive signal that it is possible to go into an administration where you think things might not be operating normally and maintain certain bedrock values for now.
Right. So there seems to be sort of a common thread, right? Unprecedented challenge, and yes, institutions are sort of shaking, but they're still standing, and we'll come back to some of this. Michael, you talk to business leaders in particular a lot, and they have to think about, do I get involved? Do I support? Do I provide advice? Or at what point do I keep my distance? So what have you heard, and how has the thinking perhaps evolved? And if the question comes up, what advice do you give to CEOs about how to engage and whether to engage?
So first, it's worth just noting that the first 2 years of any administration are turbulent. If you go back through the Obama administration, General Jones, Rahm Emanuel, Chief of Staff, General Jones was his national security advisor, Greg Craig, the White House counsel, all were there for less than 2 years. If you go back to President Bush, Paul O'Neill, the Treasury Secretary, Mitch Daniels, who ran OMB, Christine Todd Whitman, who ran the EPA, were all there less than 2 years. So you're going to get a lot of churn in your first 2 years. We jokingly call it's Normandy. It's a lot of people rush to an administration because it's a new administration. It's exciting, a lot of casualties. It's really those second and third times that you really start to see people who stay for much longer and where the impacts really happen. And then the fourth piece, the last 2 years are ones where the legacy building is really there and more of the loyalists get promoted. And you see a lot more of that. So these first 2 years are, in some ways, some of the turnover and the turbulence is to be expected. Some of it's not, right? And the part that isn't really has come down to a very fundamental choice that a lot of people have been wrestling with, which is that do you serve the president or do you serve the office? And that's a very tough decision to make. Many people will say it's worth serving, period, because the people I'm serving are the American people, not the president. The president occupies that office, and I need to do the best job I can for as long as I can. And knowing that it may not end well for me, or I may not be able to have the full impact that I had expected. And others say that's just a price that's too high to pay, that there's better ways to be able to have your voices heard. In the business community, the business community is much more thinking about this in terms of the institution. And that's why you've seen the engagement that you've seen. You've also, though, seen where the business community has seen where the had some deep fundamental issues with the president on Charlottesville, for instance, and you can see the actions that the CEOs took in terms of resigning from the councils that President Trump put together. And you can see some CEOs being outspoken on some uncertain issues, but more of them than not see the presidency itself as as an important function for their global operations, and where they can quietly disagree, but publicly they're still going to stand behind the president of the United States. So those are the conversations that I've been privy to, and there've been quite a few of them. But there are more of them than there ever have been about which side, how to think about it. And the advice I would give would be that you really, it's easy to have values when times are easy. It's much harder to hold to your values when times are hard.
Right.
And this is a really fundamental time to really push on your own values and not just your thoughts, but just how do they hold up in times where you know that you may have some disagreements with what is happening, and then how do you express your discomfort in a way that's constructive.
So this is, I think, the key issue, right? That is on our minds. So let's go a little bit deeper there. You know, Christina, if one of your alums, for example, called you up and said, "Look, I have fundamental disagreements with aspects of the policy of this administration, but I'm concerned about the independence of the Justice Department," or "I do believe that we ought to follow proper administrative procedure in the EPA and so on, and I'm thinking about getting involved," what advice would you give him?
So I think that whether to get involved depends on where you get involved. And I get this question a lot from my students too, who are thinking about where to go in the next few years after they graduate. I think that if you're headed for a high-level political position, you have to be prepared to own what this administration does, right? And I think that's true regardless of the administration you enter into. I think even in that setting, accepting that there will be disagreement is part of the job, especially if you're not the principal. You have to carry out what other people decide is the right decision to make, even if you're at the table making the decision. I think if you're deciding whether to enter into a career civil service position, which many young lawyers are thinking about, because the government is a phenomenal training ground. You get a lot of high-level responsibilities and experience early on in your career, and you can do incredibly interesting work. I think the question you have to ask yourself is, what's the state of the agency and then the particular issue area that you would be working on? So I think for someone who wants to be a civil rights litigator, who is not conservative, this is not the time to go to the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. But someone who wants to be a civil litigator could very well have a meaningful career even in a turbulent setting. So I really think it depends a lot on the type of position you're stepping into, and then the state of the agency and the policy area you would be stepping into.
Yeah. And so, Michael, similar question to you, and you should, just weigh in even on the same question. But, you guys have lots of interns. You get the interns from some of the top international relations and public policy programs. If somebody comes to you at the end of the summer and says, "You know what? I think I want to join the State Department. They seem to have openings right now." What do you say?
Well, I would be excited because that means there would be openings right now. There really isn't. That question has been asked, and there hasn't been recently, although we hope that does change. Very similar to what Christina said, just recognize what you're going into. This will be, people will ask questions for the rest of your career about why you chose to enter. There are some very good answers for why you would choose to do it, but go in eyes wide open about the type of impact you would have and and really understand the local situation, who you would be working with, who would be people you would report to, what the policies are, so you know what type of experience generally you could expect to have. If your expectations and that reality are close to being aligned, then it's always good to. We need talented people to serve. We just need talented people to serve. But if they're not aligned, that could be difficult for you and difficult for the organization you're trying to serve, and will cause those questions, which you'll always be asked, to be a little bit more complicated in terms of your answer.
So what do you do once you're there, right? So you go in with the best intentions. You think this is good training ground. You know that people have a right to a functioning government. You may think that you have skills that you can contribute, and if you don't take the role, somebody else will who might not have those skills. Mm-hmm. And then you're there, and there's sort of disagreement, policy disagreement. As you say, that's normal. That happens. Pluralist society, and elections have consequences. But what are your options if you begin to have some serious concerns, mm-hmm. for example, about no proper vetting of policies, scientific advice is being ignored, mm-hmm. Civil servants are being pressured to adopt certain policies. What can people do?
So I think that you start from the premise, whether you're a lawyer or economist, scientist, that you give the best advice that you can. I think for lawyers in particular, you could always appeal to the fidelity to the law, and ensuring that whatever actions you're taking are within existing legal authorities, where there's always going to be room for interpretation, but there's a reasonable spectrum of arguments one could make about what's permissible. I think once you feel like there are policies emerging that you disagree with, then the question becomes, is it that you disagree with the policy because you would come to a different conclusion? And that sort of disagreement is one you should expect when you're in a collaborative decision-making environment. Or do you think that legal authorities or ethical lines have been transgressed? And there are at least three different kinds of options. I mean, one is to try to express dissent from within. There are some agencies that have internal dissent channels. I think the State Department's dissent channel is the most famous, but there are other ways of potentially doing that. In discrete instances where you think there's corruption or abuse or something along those lines, there may be whistleblower protections. Those are extreme circumstances. Yeah. So I don't think most people confront scenarios like that, but those exist. And then there's always the option of resigning. And I think that we see headlines, I don't know how pervasive this phenomenon is, of career people resigning from agencies where they think they can no longer do the job. And that's particularly true where bedrocks of the agency, like scientific evidence, are being discounted, where political leadership is not listening to the career people who are expert in whatever it is that they do, or people within the State Department who don't feel, as Michael suggested, they're being used because the State Department doesn't seem to care as much about diplomacy as any of its predecessors. And so that's always an option. It's in some ways a more meaningful option for long-term career officials or high-level political people because they make a splash, they make a headline. The people I'm most concerned about are about the young lawyers or other policy types who are trying to build a career in government, and it's not clear where they'll go. They could certainly go to the private sector, but that's not what many people had in mind. And there it's harder to know whether to hold on and wait out something or not. And then I think you have to ask yourself kind of internal questions about your own personal ethics and how far you're willing to say this is just my role versus I cannot be complicit in whatever it is that's happening. And that's very situational.
Yeah. Michael, what's your advice on this? Some people say, when you go into a situation that you might think will involve some of those ethical challenges, you got to write a letter to yourself, dear Michael, in the future, this is when you should leave. I mean, does stuff like this work?
Well, it's always good to have a very clear sense of what you're expecting and to really test your own values. That's pretty critical. I think Christina laid it out beautifully in the thought process. I would just put that in, I would add to that by just saying that in any administration, there is a tension between the political appointees and the career civil service. And every political appointee has a short period of time to get a number of things done or not done. And the career civil service really has a much longer viewpoint knows the issues probably a lot more deeply. And in some cases, even very activist administrations where you agree may make serious missteps where you feel like the issue's been handled carefully for a very long time, and all of a sudden it's not being handled as carefully. And that can cause some issues. And other times there's just inattention. And currently, all of that is happening. So there could be an environment where people just aren't paying attention to what you're doing at all, and there's a lot of civil servants are really advancing quietly some policies that have been put forth across administrations. But certainly, when you run across a situation where your values are different than the values of either the administration or an organization that you're working for in the private sector, I mean, there's a few things, and this echoes what Christina was highlighting. The first is really seek to understand what the difference is. There's an outcome where you feel X and you think the organization represents Y, but it's worth asking, what's the rationale behind that? What other stakeholders are you trying to solve for? What pressures are you feeling that are causing you not to take this particular position? Is that position a permanent one, or one that you're trying to get to a larger issue and you need to go down this route? Being able to understand what that is pretty critical to being able to conclude that your values are not in the same place. And that's part of what you would do even as a diplomat. I mean, where across the world there are different points of view. The point is to really start to understand what those issues are, tease them apart, understand where the pressure points are, and then engage in a dialogue. To engage in that dialogue, you would want to start with friendlies, people who you are familiar with, people who are familiar with you, to test your own thinking, make sure that it's logical, that you don't have some missteps in your own thinking, and then work from there. Quite often, what we find is that the issues are more complex. They're not as black and white as they appear. That there are other pressures which may or may not make you more sympathetic, depending on what it is. But it will give you a fuller appreciation for both the stance of the organization or the government, and also help develop your own moral compass.
Right. So be clear what it is you're hoping to get out of it. Be clear what lines you are not, what the lines are for you, but then have a group of friends and others you can talk to and say, look, this is where I am, and let me know if I'm beginning to rationalize things that perhaps I shouldn't. Christina, you said earlier that becoming a whistleblower is a pretty extreme thing. And we talk about whistleblowers sufficiently often that we think, this sort of happens all the time, that there are grounds that give rise to that. But perhaps one step below that is leaking. Right. We see a lot of leaking, and it seems like, maybe this is a caricature, but there's civil servants or people in government who are like, I'm committed to this, but there's just a couple of things that aren't okay, and I want the world to know. And it's fairly easy just to set up the National Park Service had its alternative Twitter account where they were subtweeting on everything the agency was doing, or you have rogue civil servants in quotation marks who talk about anything from Ben Carson's dining set to where Scott Pruitt was and when Jeff Sessions met with whom. Help us understand sort of leaking as a phenomenon, but also how it fits into a situation where people are trying to navigate these challenging situations where they have a commitment to the country, they have a commitment to their office, but they feel they might have issues with leaders in those offices, and they feel they do that. Is that ever okay?
Yes. So I think there are two potentially contradictory ways of thinking about leaking, but both of them are important. The first is that the government as an ecosystem depends on leaks, and there's good legal scholarship on the way in which high-level officials actually want leaks to occur. There are ways of sending out trial balloons. There are ways of managing accountability concerns that an agency might have. So they play an important function in a larger democratic setting, and also for the institutional legitimacy of the government. That said, it's also highly problematic for individuals to take it upon themselves to leak. Obviously, leaking classified information is something you could get in serious trouble for, and one ought never to advocate. But I think there's a larger question about whether we want people to work outside of the chains of responsibility and supervision. And imagine in an agency where you have a political leadership that you like, having civil servants going rogue, trying to undermine that agency. So during the Obama years, for example, when he initiated a range of immigration reform actions, there were enforcement officials within ICE who objected to what he was trying to do to reshape immigration enforcement, and believed that they had an independent duty to interpret the Constitution and the law and apply it as they saw fit. That's a highly problematic way of running an agency, especially a top-down enforcement agency. And so I would be wary of a general principle, even under times of stress, where government workers or officials who didn't have some kind of higher level authorization took it upon themselves to leak. I think things like the subtweeting might be innocuous, ancillary examples where it's not about revealing what's happening on the inside so much as in a way that might compromise deliberation or policy formation, as it is about expressing a kind of frustration. But those are very tricky steps to take, and I wouldn't generally suggest that absent something where whistleblowing is appropriate, or where you can run it up to a higher level position where there can be high level authorization for some kind of leak, that anyone step outside of the bounds in that way.
Right. And you're good to remind us with the ICE example that this is not something that is unique to this administration. In fact, if Jim Comey is to be believed, he said he had no choice but to send the letter in October because somebody in the FBI was going to leak if he didn't. And so, I mean, that raises a question more generally about how can you run effective policy if you think the place is leaking. And Michael, sort of particularly from a foreign policy perspective, I mean, we were talking today about a decision about the Iran nuclear deal. There are preparations going on for a summit with Kim Jong-un. There are all kinds of contentious issues in particular. I mean, does a government function if there's a sort of constant threat of people going rogue and going outside? Isn't the sort of responsible thing then to say, I can't be on board with this, I leave, and at least, let the people who are currently making decisions, run policy?
No, it's a good question. I mean, Christina again laid out something really important, which is leaking has been, it can be quite effective. It's been a very strong tradition for how to get out particular issues early, to trial balloons, to engage a set of stakeholders that will be very difficult to do overtly. But usually the channels are also well defined when it's effective. And there's a rule of the game there that has been established, and the information is treated accordingly. The issue comes when leaks happen and you don't know exactly where it's going. And with the proliferation of channels now, and the lack of rules of the game in those channels as they're being established, it becomes a lot harder to know what the impact of that information is and will be on the government and on any particular policy or any particular set of people. It's very in foreign policy. There's always been very clear channels, right? And those channels have been well established. They're run by foreign service officers who have had extensive training for how to handle these types of these situations and the information. For those of us who are still in government who do more foreign policy, we've been Senate confirmed, which means that we've gone through extensive vetting and have been trained as well for how to handle the information that we have. The problem now is that information that isn't always handled by people who have that experience. Having said that, with the news cycles today and with the establishment of fake news, it's what the rest of the world is trying to decipher is just what's real and what's not. And the overarching response has been just to wait and see, not to react to any piece of news necessarily, just wait to see what the actions are more than what is being said, which makes that information not as credible as it used to be. And so it is a confusing time as it relates to leaking, for sure.
I just want to remind folks that they can submit questions via Zoom or Facebook or YouTube or live stream. There you have it on the screen. And Thomas Nordberg did that, and he's asking, to what degree are people expected to compromise with their values while serving in government, for example, at the State Department? I mean, is there sort of, again, where's the boundary, I guess, between sort of policy disagreement and value compromise? I mean, what would be something that is a value compromise, and are there value compromises that should be expected as opposed to those that shouldn't be?
So I think in some ways that's an easy question for a lawyer
Yes.
to answer, though it's not always easy to answer every specific case.
Yeah.
So I think when this question comes up a lot about the time I spent clerking on the Supreme Court and the conundrum a lot of people faced about overseeing death penalty
Yes.
cases. And for many people that presented an ethical concern. Can you provide legal assistance to a justice who's ultimately going to sign off on an execution if you believe the death penalty is morally wrong? And I think that most lawyers come to the conclusion that it's legally authorized. It's something with which I morally disagree. If there's not a legal flaw in the way that the sentence was imposed, then that's part of what it means to be a lawyer, is to interpret and apply the law and provide legal advice based on existing law. For some people, though, that does cross an ethical line, whether it's because of religious beliefs or other moral beliefs, and will, as a conscientious objector, ask to be excused from that kind of decision making. I think that has to be rare in a legal system where lawyers are called upon to represent the interests of all of humanity in a range of ways. But that said, there also have to be limits to the kinds of orders you're willing to accept. But I think it's only in the most extreme cases where it's clear what you're being asked to do is a violation of the law or a violation of some larger international legal principle or moral norm, that's the moment at which you make a decision about whether you can obey a command.
And it sounds that from a legal perspective, you should be able to anticipate even going into something where your values might be challenged, right? I mean, knowing that you're going to clerk for a Supreme Court justice, you know that there are going to be some issues where the particular justice is going to lean one way, and you're going to still have to offer them the best support. But that's different from situations where all of a sudden the playbook is being ripped up, or the agency's independence is being challenged and so on. Is that fair?
Yeah, or where you think that there has been an egregious violation of law or legal norms, or for each individual there are certain ethical lines you decide you cannot cross. And sometimes how you draw those will depend on your legal surroundings, but often there will be other sources of authority that are telling you what the right line is.
So one thing that is wonderful about legal education, I think the way so many lawyers think, is this sort of clarity and principles. And I'm going to offer a caricature now of CEOs and business people, but they're just pragmatic. It's about getting the job done, whatever works. Of course, we have values and we have principles, but we sort of, it's about outcomes as much as it is about tools or ways of approaching certain issues. And so, Michael, is it fair to say that for a lot of business people, when they've confronted questions about engagement with the administration through counsels and so on, it's been very much about sort of pragmatism? Does it make sense? And I guess my question is, how do you then, if for a lawyer, it's somewhat easier perhaps to say, I see at what point my values are being challenged and I may have to disengage. How does that look like for business leaders who are working on behalf of their customers, their shareholders, their employees? They're supposed to be pragmatic and outcome-oriented, yet at one point comes a moment where they have to reconsider. Is that only because at that point, the opportunistic thing is to pull out because the baggage becomes too much, the negative headlines become too much, or is there more principled and systematic approach to navigating those questions?
Oh, it's a great question. First and foremost, CEOs, business leaders, they feel a responsibility to create shareholder value and their stakeholders are their shareholders or their customers. But increasingly and importantly, CEOs now, their jobs on a day-to-day basis look more like a president of a country than it does only as a traditional operating executive. Sure, the operating prowess still has to be there, the experience, the ability to deliver the value from that business's perspective, but they have to manage a number of other stakeholders that perhaps even 5 or 10 years ago were less likely to impact their share value. I mean, look at what has happened with Facebook recently as being a case in point. And so in that context, CEOs are much now looking at risk-adjusted long-term shareholder value creation and starting to incorporate the very principles we've been talking about in the government and are seeking advice for how best to do that, which is, we've certainly at Albright Stonebridge Group has seen that be very much the case. And seeing so many issues that used to be more in the government sphere become CEO issues. For those CEOs and in particular, their personal viewpoints, as opposed to what their companies represent, is also become increasingly something that they have to manage. If it's in alignment, that's fine. Some are saying that they don't have a right to express their views. That's not their job. Their job is to be the CEO and not to have their personality or their personal views dominate what the company is set to do. And others feel that that by virtue of being in the job, they have a responsibility to speak out on certain issues. And so,
go ahead.
Please.
Sorry.
So that is becoming increasingly a dialogue between CEOs, and you see CEOs talk to each other about how they're trying to manage that, and there's not a clear answer.
So let's explore that sort of from a governance perspective, right? So when you have CEOs like Ed Stack, the CEO of Dick's Sporting Goods, say, you know what, regardless of what the government decides is the right age or the legal age to buy an assault rifle, in our stores it's going to be 21. And we're going to discontinue selling this and selling that. And when banks come in and say, we're going to no longer underwrite transactions that we have quarrels with, is that courageous values-based leadership? Is that opportunism in a sort of hyper-polarized political environment? Is that a form of governance that we may be applauding if we agree with the current goals, but is problematic because it's really the job of Congress to make these kinds of decisions and not the job of the CEO of Dick's? I'm curious what your perspectives are about business leaders then stepping into perhaps the vacuum that we're seeing.
So I wouldn't depend on Congress to step into any moral vacuums or to provide leadership. I think that from someone who's not part of the corporate world, it seems important for corporations that have incredible impact on the lives of many people and are institutions that help shape our world, for corporate leaders to be thinking about these things. And it's not a substitute for legislative action or government action. It's a complement to, and maybe even a prod to government action. And so obviously the head of a corporation could take a position with which I would disagree, and then I would decide as a consumer whether I want to eat a Chick-fil-A or buy Pepsi or whatever it is. And maybe by forcing those kinds of decisions on the individual level, this is outside of my domain, corporate leaders are misrepresenting their shareholders. That's a debate I think worth having inside the corporation. But I think that that in a world where we cannot depend on our institutions to solve problems, you need the help of the private sector to solve those problems.
So business pragmatism becomes potentially a resource in that setting. What do you think, Michael, about this?
No, that's I think very much the same thing. I think it's a combination of all the factors that you laid out, David, and they're all different on a different issue. So the same CEO may have a different calculus of pragmatism, courage of their convictions, pressure from certain stakeholders, just depending on what the issue is. What's clear, as Christina said, is that if CEOs wait for governments to set the rules for themselves, they will likely find themselves in more trouble. So if, for instance, if technology companies wait for the privacy laws to be completely carried out by the government, they're going to lose a lot of shareholder value if they don't take a stand and figure out what the rules of the game should be and what the rules of the road should be for certain policy issues. What many CEOs are saying is that they want to return businesses to being responsible corporate citizens in the way that there's perhaps was maybe a century ago for some businesses. Obviously, for some they certainly weren't. But to really see their role as a larger one in society, not just in terms of what near-term profits they can make. And more of the shareholder activists and the pension funds and other major shareholders are demanding this and withholding votes from either boards or senior executives that don't exhibit those behaviors. And so increasingly, you see CEOs who come to us and say, I have to have a certain set of issues that I need to be a leader in policy on because it's going to be important for my business, but it's also going to be important for our role in society.
And is that, Michael, something that you're hearing primarily in the U.S., or is this a global phenomenon?
Oh, it's certainly a global phenomenon. In fact, I'd say global CEOs are ahead of the U.S. in many respects on this. If you look at Unilever, you can go down the list of standard-bearing companies that have really taken this on for quite a while, who have much more familiarity operating locally in various countries and understand the dynamics about being a good local citizen while being able to uphold the overall values of the corporation itself and having those tensions whenever they arise be resolved in a productive way. The U.S. is because of its dominance and for so long is a little bit newer to this, and so you see CEOs from U.S.-based Fortune 500 companies, by and large, really starting to grapple with some of these issues fulsomely now, and ever more so.
And what advice do you have when somebody comes to you and says, look, I lead a leading global company. We're being pulled into all kinds of policy debates about climate change or about inequality or public health or infrastructure or cybersecurity or data privacy. I mean, is there a similar set of recommendations that you have for CEOs, how to play a role, how to engage in those issues that sort of perhaps corresponds to the way Christina laid out, young lawyers think about getting engaged in the policy process? Because in the end, you are beginning to play a policy or a political role in this and might have to go through a similar process of saying, this is where I'm going to go, this is where I'm not going to go, this is my role as a CEO, and this is my role as a citizen, which might still be distinct.
No, in fact, at Albright Stonebridge Group, we counsel CEOs routinely on this and the process by which you really become a global citizen, which is a multi-faceted process to be able to be aware of the issues that both your company faces, what the CEOs will face specifically, the impact on other stakeholders, the understanding of what those stakeholders' environments are, how to align those stakeholders. So you create situations where you're helping a number of stakeholders become better off in decisions you make, which means you're not necessarily maximizing your short-term value creation at all times. Being able to operate with looking at operating your company with multiple dials, not just the operational dials that you've typically looked at, and to be able to create both the networks to be able to learn from others, so you have both eyes and ears to make sure that you really understand the current information. It requires a different mindset and a different way you spend your time. When we've seen that the CEOs who have been able to adapt to this, their tenures are longer. I mean, the average tenure of CEOs now, is down for large cap Fortune 500 companies is what, around 5 years or so. If you look at what Harvard Law's corporate governance and financial stability conference said. There's increasing pressure around these issues if they're going to stay in the job and be able to have the impact that they want to have. And it's why you see even succession plans look a little bit more broadly for who the potential successors to a CEO, current CEO might be.
Right. And so if business is becoming more political, not just in the U.S., but globally, and you don't have a lot of faith in legislation from Congress, and I think you're not the only one. So if you're consulting or you're coaching a current law student who might be passionate about data privacy, for example, should they join Facebook or the FTC?
I think actually the FTC is one of the bright spots in
right.
the government. so that's an easy one.
Okay.
and I think it underscores that the
Yeah.
independent agencies are a place where there's a lot of business as usual. I think that a lot of people align, regardless of their party affiliation, behind the mission of the FTC. I think it depends. I do encourage a lot of students to go into government.
Yeah.
I think that if you want to engage in policymaking, the executive branch is the place to go. Working on the Hill can be enormously rewarding, but also incredibly frustrating, and it's everyone who emerges from that experience talks about how the horse trading can be enervating. But I also think that this state government and local government is a place where there's a lot of interesting work to be had for lawyers, and a lot of policy possibilities to pursue. And there's, of course, because the federal government's in the hands of the whole federal government, in the hands of the Republican Party, a lot of energy in progressive circles around state and local actors and decision makers. And so you could take advantage of that. And there are a lot of places to go, even though state legislatures are also complex beasts where you can really get things done if you don't focus just on our pretty dysfunctional national legislative process.
So that's a good reminder. I'm glad we took it to the global level and now to the state level, and so that's a good way of moving to it, some wrap up and takeaways. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask both of you with your vantage points and your experience to just sort of reflect a little bit on the state of American democracy and the strength and challenges to our institutions. So on balance, are you more concerned about how quickly some of them have begun to falter, or are you quite impressed how resilient they've been? And if so, where do you see resilience and where do you see cracks that are really disconcerting?
Yeah, so I'm cautiously confident in the system as a whole. I think its complexity is what will save it from destruction, and I think there are many people from both parties invested in the integrity of our institutions, and I think most of our institutions are strong. What makes me nervous is the prospect that the administration or the president himself might cross a truly egregious line and there would be no reaction. If there's no reaction from Congress, if he fires the special counsel or all of the Department of Justice's leadership, or if he starts directing investigations himself, then I would be truly concerned, because I think it might also reflect a deeper public malaise. And I'm also deeply concerned about the distrust that hasn't started with this administration, which dates back of evidence-based decision-making and science. You start eroding that, and then I do think that you have a problem where you can't find a ground on which everyone can meet, and it just becomes about preference. And that's not a way to run a system of government as complex as the United States government. So there are things that are imminent in our culture that make me very nervous, but I think that our institutions and the investment of people in their integrity will save us.
Michael, what do you think?
So I also am cautiously optimistic. I'm not. Our country was founded for times like this, and the checks and balances, the levels, not only at the federal level but the state and local level, the intersection between the government and the private sector, all have a number of stakeholders who really do have a voice, and of course the American people all have a voice in the governance of our country. It's why when times are relatively calm, the government can seem a bit cumbersome, as Christina was saying, being complex. It was built for times where to prevent a certain set of ideas or a certain set of people, regardless of what those ideas were, from being able to overturn the country too far. And so far, as we've seen, as Christina was referencing very early in our conversation about the number of policies and laws that were constructed that didn't go through because of the checks and balances, we're going to continue to see that. America is a relatively young country, but it is one that has had challenges in the past. And when we go back and we look at them and we see how we've responded over time, I think we will come out in the right place yet again. I mean, it's been said that, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And whether that is true or not, it's certainly one that is built for resilience. And so far, I'm sure we all have our views on whether it's resilient enough certain things, but by and large, the core has held, and I expect it to continue to.
Well, I appreciate these concluding perspectives, and what you're reminding us is that as good as the constitutional design may be, as brilliant as the institutions may have been designed, at the end, there are people in those institutions, and the choices that they make matter, and whether they follow proper procedures and base their decisions on sound advice and evidence is what is going to matter. And that requires people who have those skills to participate in that process. And while you have to be very conscious of what you're getting yourself into and what your values are, and that's true in all administration, maybe particularly challenging in this administration, it doesn't absolve people, it doesn't absolve us from being engaged, because it's our democracy, yes. It's our order, it's our institutions.
That's right.
And David, I would just like to say to all the students who are listening, you have an extraordinary moment for leadership right now. And however you choose to exercise that, this is a time when your voice, your ideas are going to matter more than ever. And just with the advent of technology, with the world that we're in right now, there are multiple ways to have enormous impact. You do not have to wait your turn. And so I would encourage each and every one of you who are listening to us to just seize those opportunities. We need you to be able to make the world a better place. So really good time to be where you are at Yale.
Yeah.
Perfect conclusion. Well, thank you so much, Christina.
Thank you,
Michael. And thank you to all who have connected, who've commented on the conversation. Please keep it going. We're all reachable through social media, and look forward to continuing the conversation that way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.